If God is so good and so loving, why do we hurt each other? Why is there so much sin? Why can't God deal with that?
It's all women's fault that the world is as bad as it is.
Welcome to Religious Rejects, the podcast where we dig into religious ideas and decide if they are worth keeping or tossing. I'm Christine, your amateur historian and resident skeptic.
And I'm Alycia, your theology geek and also a skeptic. Today, we're going to explore the roots and the implications of these ideas with some banter along the way.
And this is a fun one. This is a big one. We're going to tackle the cornerstone of Christian theology, original sin.
Dun, dun, dun.
But not just going to sit on religious original sin alone. We're also going to compare it to the lesser known concept of original blessing.
Ooh. These two ideas represent fundamentally different views of humanity and the world. Are we inherently flawed or are we created good? It's a question with enormous implications for how we live, believe, and interact with the world. It's also been a central struggle in my own spiritual journey. I'm a woman, I'm a lesbian, and so original sin has really had a lot of implications for my own spiritual beliefs.
All right, so let's start. This concept, original sin, is really, really interesting because it is a Christian concept, but it's actually only Western Christian, which is very interesting. Believe it or not, other Christians don't necessarily believe this. And because the concept itself came, in theory, from the Genesis, you would think that, Judaism, this would be a big thing, but Judaism does not follow original sin. And in fact, the term itself, original sin, is not even in the Bible.
No.
There is no evidence that the early Christians believed this. And that's actually kind of like, now you can take some of Paul's stuff like Romans 5:12 when he talks about sin entering the world through Adam. And I think that's what people kind of build this idea off of. But outside of that, you have no real evidence that even Jesus, when he was walking around, he never kind of said, y'all are really bad and thank God I'm here because now I'm going to save you from sin because of what Adam did. Now you're going to talk to us about St. Augustine or Augustine. I've heard it both ways. So feel free, let us know how he is so instrumental in making this a huge thing.
So let me just say, this really brings back a lot of memories for me. I had a senior seminar on Augustine. I'm going to call him Augustine because that's how I learned how to say his name and I'm going to forget. But I had a whole senior seminar on Augustine's City of God, and I'm never going to get those hours of my life back. And it just,
but we're going to use them for good right now.
Yes.
You're going to teach us. So that's good. So we can move. We can use everything for good here.
What a good attitude. So let's start here. So Augustine, he interpreted the second creation story. And yes, there are two creation stories. There's one in Genesis 1, and there's the second one about Adam and Eve in Genesis chapters 2 and 3. And that's a conversation for a whole other episode.
That's right.
So we'll see. But this all started because of a debate with a British monk. His name was Pelagius. And he just thought that human nature was inherently good. And so anyway, the early Christian movement, there was a lot of debates going on. And eventually, Pelagius's beliefs were declared a heresy.
Was this like 4th century?
Yeah.
Where are we?
So Augustine interpreted the second creation story, the Adam and Eve story in Genesis, as a literal event that introduced sin into humanity's nature. For him, it wasn't just a bad decision. It was a rip in the fabric of the universe, and the world was never the same. Dun, dun, dun. It was a cosmic fall that corrupted all of creation. And remember what we said about biblical literalism. Last episode, we talked about that. That is something that we, as the religious rejects, reject. However, Augustine did not reject biblical literalism. So he argued that sin is passed down biologically. And it's interesting because he personally really struggled with sexual desire. And he lived with a concubine for 15 years, and he really struggled with this. And when he became a Christian, he ended up giving up all of that and he became celibate. And this annoyed me when I was in college when I learned that, because I'm like, just because you have a problem with sexual desire doesn't mean that the rest of us who live after you have to live with the consequences of your personal struggles. But anyway, here we are, many, many centuries later. So he believed that because human beings are created through procreation, through sexual desire, the very act of creating life passes what he calls the corruption of sin on to the next generation, which is why he advocated for infant baptism and why he believed that babies had to be baptized in order to receive salvation. What's interesting to me when I was preparing for this podcast is that he believed before the fall, Adam had free will to choose between good and evil. But after the fall, humanity became enslaved to sin and couldn't choose good without God's grace. And that basically humans need grace from God to overcome sin. And that's a lot. There's a lot of people today who still believe we have free will, but that also have a belief in original sin. So there's a couple of things that have gotten kind of mushed up over the years.
But this was, as we talked about earlier, a very universal Christian belief and something that kind of like built the Western churches. The popes picked it up and really kind of hammered it home in the like Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed and all of that, right? This whole idea of original sin. So therefore, we ended up really, really having it built in to our religion. And like as we talked about, it wasn't necessarily in all of the other Christian religions.
Yeah, the split between the Eastern and the Western church didn't happen until about the year 1000 something. So, when that split happened, the Western church lost a lot of, I think, beauty and mystery and mysticism to the Eastern church.
Yeah.
Eastern Orthodoxy focuses more on the consequences of Adam and Eve's actions rather than on this idea that we inherit guilt. Like Augustine would talk about, like, the baby passing through the birth canal and absorbing all the sin of the mother kind of a thing. And so it's a little much.
It is a lot of much as a mother of two. I mean, that explains a lot. I mean, if you go that way, wow, my poor kids.
He seemed a little obsessed about some of this stuff, but that's my personal opinion. So Augustine's interpretation became dominant in the Western church, partly because of the Roman Empire's influence. The Roman Empire adopted Christianity as the main religion in 380 BCE. And so sin as a legal debt fit well within the worldview of the Roman Empire at the time. And so this concept of original sin is really as much a product of historical context, cultural context, and Augustine's own personal internal struggle as it is theology. Augustine's ideas did not exist in a vacuum. They reflected his time, his struggles, and his society.
Streaming from the heart of the Rockies, this is Religious Rejects. Watch, listen, and join the discussion at religiousrejects.com.
All right, let's flip the script now and let's talk about original blessing. Okay, so this is also, to be clear, not found anywhere in the Bible, that specific word or phrase, original blessing. But the concept starts, as we talked about earlier, in that first creation story, where every single thing God made, he said was good. And I'm using he right now just for a second, even though it does say, let us make man, meaning mankind, in our own image. And then everything after that was, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good. And I love that because it just continues to just really just good, good. The term original blessing wasn't necessarily formalized until this modern era by a guy named Matthew Fox, who I absolutely love.
He's still alive today.
Yes, he is, and doing great things. But he argued that Christianity had just become too obsessed with guilt and shame and losing sight of the goodness of the inherent creation.
And it's a fair critique, I think.
Absolutely.
His work was very controversial. In fact, so controversial that he was kicked out of his religious order by...
Fellow reject.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's to you, Matthew Fox. He was actually kicked out by the Pope for what he published. But what he wrote, though, really has resonated with people who are looking for a more life-affirming spirituality. He emphasized gratitude, interconnectedness, and the idea that we are co-creators with God.
Now, I've also read Daniel Schroyer's book, Original Blessing, which, yes, has the same name as Matthew Fox's book, where she takes Fox's very academic theological views on original blessing and really humanizes them. She actually paints a picture of the Genesis story being more of a coming-of-age story. So you have Adam and Eve, and they're growing up in this garden, and they see this, the tree that they're not supposed to be near, eat from, all of that good stuff. And yet they do, because it's almost like it's just that age. It's something that people at that age do. Now they're probably teenagers. What's amazing is if you really see it, they eat this fruit, whatever it is. I don't know if it was an apple or not, but whatever the fruit was. And all of a sudden, they notice they're naked. It's like all of a sudden they've just grown up. And you get the kind of feeling like God is seemingly very disappointed. And I think, again, that's where this whole idea of they've sinned, they've done something horribly wrong, and now they need to be kicked out of this garden. But there's as a mother of two, you watch your kids grow up and they do start to push these boundaries. They do start to get very, very independent, and you can start to feel that things are not comfortable anymore. And it's, as a parent, you have to recognize that it's time for them to go. And it's sad, but it's also really good. So as I read it as an empty nester, I was seeing God, his sadness over the event, as something completely different. He knows it's time to say goodbye. He knows it's time for them to be pushed out and into the world.
Yeah.
When I've read that from Danielle Schroyer, I was like, that really is an interesting kind of take on it. And I really liked it because it just made, like, nothing is bad, bad, bad. It's all from a good place, but yes, you are growing up. And so it's time for you to kind of move on.
It's more of a developmental understanding of human nature, where they were kind of just growing up like we understand growing up to happen.
Right. And I think that is like, when you really stop and take a look at it, of course, God would then know the parent's heart because God already went through it. And so it's such a natural thing. So it's like, did somebody take this story and make it way more than it should have been? And it really should have been something that we actually recognize in just everyday life. Yeah. Every single one of us have to be the child that grows up that is pushing against the parents. And most of us have to let people go. I mean, whether they have children or not, there's always somebody in their life that they need to let go and release. And it was just like, wow, is it more of a natural thing instead of this big, monumental, oh my gosh, you've just destroyed your whole world and everybody that's going to come behind you.
Yeah.
So now that we have a better understanding of the views, let's play a little game called Devil's Advocate.
Okay.
Because that feels right for a Religious Rejects podcast. We're going to play Devil's Advocate. So let's just talk about the goods and the bads of kind of both. So we kind of level out the playing field a little bit. We get kind of both sides. So if original sin is a thing, okay, if this is a real thing, why is it that humanity is punished for just these two people's actions?
Such a good question. Another question is, if original sin is true and a real theology, why is it then not included in Jewish theology, since it's based on a creation story from their tradition?
Right, which I think is always interesting that Christians want to ignore that part. Like I always find that fascinating that like, okay, if what we believe in has been based from this Old Testament, why then don't we share the same beliefs from them? And who are we to say that they got it wrong on their beliefs?
Right.
You know what I'm saying? It's
Yeah.
like I love the audacity of, oh, well, you didn't read that right. That was actually, God saying, get out kind of a thing. So
And let's not forget that Jesus was Jewish. He was born a Jew, he lived a Jew, and he spent his whole life as a Jew. So he would have been very much steeped in the Jewish tradition. So if this was something that was not part of the Jewish tradition, why is it part of our tradition?
exactly. Another thing, if sin is passed through birth, how did it miss Jesus?
Mm. Some magic wand. Don't you know about the magic wand theory?
Because technically, like, and I understand that we want to like make Jesus. I mean, obviously, he's God, and I don't want to take away from that. But he also had a mother, and now again, that's a whole nother podcast. Was Mary perfect? Was she not perfect? You know what I mean? Yeah,
But if Jesus passed through the birth canal of
That's
Mary,
right. That's
he
right.
absorbed
That's right.
the sin of Mary.
Then Augustine's whole theory is like gone. What I also find fascinating is how much we have had to, and when I say we, how much the church has had to like make allowances for. So let's say if we were all born sinners, Augustine would say, well then just get baptized. So then you have to ask, well, what if a child dies in childbirth? So it was alive, but it didn't get baptized. So where does that child go? Does that mean that child was a sinner right off the bat? And then now you keep going in that. And it's like, so then somebody comes up with a whole nother idea. Oh, well, babies don't have the right mindset to be, so they're saved because they can't make up their mind to be saved or not to be saved. So now we have to add that on. Or we develop this whole other like waiting room, the whole purgatory idea.
Right, yes.
And we're going to wait for Jesus to come so then we can then be saved for him. So, but how many years of people are in this waiting room? And what does that mean? So I think for me, the original sin idea just doesn't work on so many levels because you have to keep adding these like layers in order to make it work.
Yes, I hear you
Yeah.
100%.
Yes.
On the other hand, so if we're looking at this idea of original blessing, does original blessing deny the reality of sin? One of the critiques of this way of thinking and this theology is that it doesn't take human capacity for evil seriously enough. So I don't know. That's one of the questions to grapple with on that.
I think that's a fair question too, because I think it almost kind of comes down to that whole same argument that if God is so good and so loving, why do we hurt each other? Why is there so much sin? Why can't God deal with that? And I think that's a really good question. I also think, though, too, if you go back to what Daniel Schroyer was saying, and if it's more of a coming of age, it doesn't eliminate that there is sin and that these consequences of things that we do, or these consequences of just growing and trying to find out who we really are, well, yes, it is sin, but we can we're still loved. We're still good. But it's just now we have to understand, I don't know, what we need God for, how God really loves us. I think there's a lot there, but
Yeah.
you know.
And really, the whole original sin, original blessing framework is trying to answer this question of where does evil come from in the world?
Right.
Why does evil exist? And is it humanity's fault? Is it God's fault? Where did it come from? And so
Yeah.
it's really getting at a very core issue about where does evil come from and why is it in the world?
Right.
So,
Yeah. Sometimes it's just kind of so sad to hear people, and again, you have to recognize it's because of their worldview, is when they say things like, if God loved me, why did this happen?
mhm.
And again, that idea that if something bad happens, God must not like you.
Yeah.
I mean, that came from this original sin idea.
Yeah.
And so they're doing everything they can to make this God love them, who I believe already does.
Yes. Yeah, but this God is punishing them, or their faith isn't strong enough, or they didn't pray the right way, or whatever. I mean, there's all these things that get caught up in it, and it has a profound effect on people's individual prayer lives, faith lives, and what's going on in their families. They turn it back on themselves and blame themselves for things that happen, which I don't agree with.
Right. So, original blessing, however, would contradict what seemingly Paul teaches as far as I'm a good evangelical. I know the Romans road like the back of my hand. But, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and the wages of sin are death. And those are I know, right? And so it does seemingly contradict that.
We need more sound effects, I think, in this podcast.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yes, you were saying.
Well, I was saying, like, it does seemingly contradict what the word says, or not necessarily the word, what Paul says in the Bible. And, and how does that work? If we've all sinned and fallen short, and the wages of these sins is death, except if you believe in Jesus, blah, 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 which then brings you to the next question. What was the point of Jesus? If there is an original blessing, why did Jesus have to come and die? So those kind of two questions kind of go together.
And then I'm going to ask, but did Jesus have to die? Or what if Jesus died for a different reason?
Okay, like,
Ooh, that's going to be another podcast.
yeah, I don't even know what you're talking about. So yeah. I mean, what does that mean to you? What do you mean a different reason?
Well, what
Because
if
now I'm like, my interest is piqued.
What if Jesus didn't have to die to save all of humanity from their sin and from the wages of death? But what if Jesus died because, and this comes from liberation theologies, feminist, South American liberation theologies, African American theologies, where you're looking at systemic understandings of evil. And so when Jesus came into the world and was living his life and challenging and coming up against the Roman Empire, a systemic system of evil that was perpetuating injustice against people of Israel, the Jewish people in at the time of Jesus's life and death. He came up against that. He was challenging it, challenging it, challenging it, and they just said no more. And so then they killed him. And that's one of the beliefs that comes from the liberation theology movements, is that Jesus died because he very much understood how systemic evil works, and he kept pushing, 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 and the consequence of that is they killed him. That brings into question other questions about, well, what is salvation?
Yeah.
Which is, again, another
Yeah,
whole.
That's a lot. I'm gonna have to just
It's a
sit with
lot,
that. Yeah,
right? I know.
because that is not something I'm aware of, but again, fun to think about, makes you kind of go, Huh.
You're listening to Religious Rejects, where the convo gets real. Tap in now at religiousrejects.com.
Do you have any final thoughts?
As I was thinking about this idea of original sin versus original blessing, I realized there's so many things that we live with today that are consequences of this Western Christian belief in original sin. One of the things that comes out of this is this historical subservience of women, because if you understand the fall of Adam in the garden, it really was Eve's fault according to this worldview. And so it's all women's fault that the world is as bad as it is. And so therefore we can treat women subserviently because they were the ones that caused the problem to begin with. And so that's one of the things that, is underneath the second class citizenship in many ways of women throughout Western history. So that's one thing. A second thing is that Augustine's struggle with his own sexual desire and all of that, it set up a mind-body dualism that persisted in Christian history and theology until today, which has also had a very negative impact on the role of women in churches. It's also a big part of what underlies so much of the church issues relating to LGBTQI plus people like myself. So there's all kinds of things that come up about um, this dualism between mind and body. And so that's another consequence of original sin, the theology of original sin. And then the third consequence I've been thinking a lot about too is that if we are to be saved and go to heaven, to some other place, then it doesn't matter what we do to the world. So we can just extract whatever we want. We can take things, we can conquer things, we can do all sorts of things because this world is going to pass away. Jesus is going to come again and save us, and we're going to be somewhere else. And it doesn't matter what state we leave this earth in. And so I think, when we look at the ecological devastation that humans have wrought on so much of the world today, um, a lot of it really can be laid at the foot of this idea of original sin and how it sets up this escape hatch sort of way of thinking where you're whisked off somewhere else. Those are the things that I think we are still living with today. The effect on the role of women, the effect on the role of LGBTQ plus people, and the ecological consequences of what original sin theology has caused, what the effects have been in our world and in our lives.
I keep going back to just the whole parenting concept. I think there was always such a disconnect for me when it came to the original sin, because I could never understand how a loving God could just do that, kick people out, and then make them earn their way back. I remember thinking too, it just once I started having children, and I was like, I don't understand that God. It really made no sense to me. And so when I heard about original blessing, and I understand, like, it's maybe not a perfect thing. It doesn't necessarily work 100% with the Bible and everything that Paul was saying, but it makes more sense to me just as a parent. It just felt right. And I know things shouldn't be like feel, but also, yeah, I think it should. I think if it doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel natural, then maybe it should be looked at a little bit more. And then Jesus comes. And I think too, just the way that Jesus just loved everybody and just kept loving. And it just, for me, that was the big thing for me when it came to the original blessing concept. That's not even like something that's offered in churches. So walking around trying to understand who this God was and why it just didn't feel right, and then hearing the original blessing and then going, okay, that feels good. That makes sense. That's how I feel about my children.
Right.
Yes, they're going to make mistakes, but that never changes my love for them. And it never makes me want to say, get out of my presence.
Yeah.
Well, here's the big question. Are you keeping, rejecting, or rethinking original sin?
I am rejecting original sin. How about you?
I'm definitely rejecting original sin. I think that's one of the greatest things that ever happened is when I was able to say, you know what? No, I don't want that anymore in my life.
I I'm with you. Yeah, it opened up a way for me to remain a Christian. Honestly,
absolutely.
when I found some of these other ways of thinking and looking at the ideas of original sin, it's like, oh, I don't have to believe that and still be a Christian. And that was such a relief. And I don't think I would claim that title today if it weren't for some of the work that people have done to rethink the concept of original sin.
Absolutely. Okay, and how do we feel about original blessing?
I say keep it.
I definitely say keep it. I think there are areas I feel like, and again, I'm never going to know fully. And I think that's huge. There are some
Yes.
things that like I said, Paul continues to talk about that I wonder, again, does my filter need to change now? And I haven't quite done that all the way through. I like the filter. I'm more comfortable with that filter of original blessing. But yeah, it does kind of contradict later things that Paul says. So I think there's more stuff to look at, but I definitely want to keep it. Absolutely. I love, like I've talked a lot about my kids, but just also the way that I feel God sees me. You know, does he love me now as much as I love my kids? Whereas before, I wasn't sure.
Mm,
Like I would beat myself up because I did something wrong and oh my gosh, is he going to turn his back on me? All this stuff. And now it's like I don't have that feeling anymore. I know that God loves me. She adores me, you know? And just to be able to walk in that is so much more empowering. And I think as women, we need that empowering.
absolutely.
You know, we need to know that there is a God that adores us and we didn't fuck everything up for everybody.
Right. Well, there's so much of that idea of original sin that is so fear-based, where it's like making us afraid that we've done something wrong that is beyond God's grace or can't be saved from. And it perpetuates this sense of fear, the fear of punishment, this idea of an angry, vengeful God. And that just goes against what I always was taught. God is love. Jesus is love. That's what this is about. And so it was this thing that was very much in tension. And these two ideas, it's like they didn't really all fit together for me. And so I'm with you as far as the whole original blessing. I love this idea of being co creators with God, that we are working with God to help bring about the world that God wants us to live in, to bring about God's kingdom on earth. And with original sin, it just feels like there's always a ruler kind of slapping you down. Like, you just have to, you're always doing something wrong. And the sense of openness and creativity that comes from the idea of original blessing is so lovely.
And I also like the idea, I mean, if we're going to talk about sin, because yes, there is still sin in original blessing theology. But I love the fact that it's more like, yes, I've made a mistake. Yes, there are consequences of that mistake. But I do feel like God's going to hold my hand and walk me through it. And I think that's a huge thing too. I remember my daughter was doing a science fair project and she waited to the last minute, the classic, like, and I remember her coming to me and she was a mess. And she was so upset. And she's like, it's due tomorrow. And I was like, okay, what are you going to do about that? How are you going to fix that? And so she came up with she had to re-strategize. Well, I guess I can do this. I can talk to my teacher about this, and I can talk about that and see what happens. And I remember saying, whatever you choose to do, I'll be there with you. Obviously, she couldn't drive at the time, so I'll take you wherever you need to go. I'll do what you need to do. But what is your plan to get yourself out of this? I'm here with you, but I can't fix it for you. We're still going to be responsible for the dumbass decisions that we may have made.
Right.
You know, the things, the way that we've hurt ourselves, the way that we've hurt others. And we can't guarantee, if I hurt you, I can not guarantee that just by me saying, you know what, I effed up, and are you going to be okay? I can't guarantee how you're going to feel.
Right.
But I know how God's going to feel, I feel like. And I know that God's going to be there to walk me through it and to do the best that I can to make amends.
Yeah.
You know, I always go back to mercy triumphs over judgment. And for me, a merciful God, is always the one that's there for me. I mean, look at Peter. My gosh. Yeah. Jesus even said, here's what you're going to do in about 3 hours from now. Yeah. And sure enough, Peter does it. And then God comes back and says, yeah, you did it, didn't you?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
But do you love me? Yes. Over and over again.
Yeah.
And it was and he was still there. And so to me, again, I go to Jesus. What did Jesus do? How did he walk that through? What was that like? Did he still love? Yes. Did he push it away? No, he confronted the stuff that was wrong, but then walked it through with people.
Yes.
And I love that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess that's it.
I guess that's all we have.
Keep questioning, keep rethinking, and reject if you need to some of those things that have just hurt your hearts.
Absolutely. Join the conversation with us. We are on all the major social media platforms, and you can find us at religiousrejects.com. See you next time.
Bye.